Okay guys, next we continue on the second subtopic, the government's liability in tort. First of all, what is tort? Tort comes from the Latin words tortus, meaning crook or twisted, and the normal French word tort meaning wrong. So the literal meanings of torts, it denotes a certain civil wrongs as distinct from the criminal wrongs. According to Wingfield and Jolowitz in their book named Law of Tort, tortious liability arises from the breach of duty fixed by law. Such duty is towards persons generally, and its breach is redressable by an action for unliquidated damages. In tort, it normally provides compensations to the innocent party. Example of tort: negligence, defamation, trespass to persons, and nuisance. The very common cases in tort is negligence. So under this topic, we will scrutinize what are the requirements that must be fulfilled by the governments if the government's servant committed tort. For example, tort of negligence. So how government will be liable for tort? Example of situation: Thor and Hulk were walking under a highway bridge which was under construction, and the bridge was a government project. If suddenly the bridge collapsed and both Thor and Hulk were injured because of the collapse, both of them could claim against the governments if proven certain conditions. So what are the conditions? We must take a look into this statute. So this is the only statute that governs the government's liability in regards to tort. Government Proceedings Act 1956. The first requirement based on this statute, Section 5. The government will be liable for any wrongful act done or any neglect or default committed by any public officer if that officer is a government officer. Later we refer to this section 6, subsection 4. That officer acted in good faith and that officer acted under the orders or instructions of the government. First, you must prove that the officer who committed tort against public is a government officer. Second, he has acted in good faith, meaning that he has exercised the reasonable skills to avoid negligence, for example. And then he must acted under the orders or instructions. For example, when he committed a negligence, we must prove that in the course of his employment. Example of case for the first requirement is Muhammad Nur Effendi Muhammad Junus against Rahman Shah Alam Ibrahim and another. What happened in this case is that the plaintiff in this case succeeded to prove that the defendant was in fact a government officer under Section 5 of the Government's Proceeding Act when the lorry driven by the defendant collided with him while he was riding his motorcycle. The plaintiff also had satisfied Section 6, subsection 1 of the GPA, and he could also prove that the second defendant, the Malaysian government, was the registered owner of the lorry driven by the first defendant. So this case is to tell us that these requirements are important. You must prove that the officer who committed tort must be a government officer. The second requirement based on Section 6, subsection 1, before an action can be brought against the government, the neglect or default by an officer would have laid against such an officer personally. one must recognize which officer commits the neglect or defaults. In other words, we must identify who is that governance officer. For example, in the case of Haji Abdurrahman against governments of Malaysia, in this case, the plaintiff brought an action to recover damages arising out of traffic accidents due to the negligence of the driver of a government's vehicle. However, the court dismissed the action as the government servant was not made a party to the actions as required by the Government's Proceedings Act, which contemplates that the identity of the officer must be established before the governments can be made liable. So the first case here failed to follow the requirements. They failed to recognize which officer who commits the negligence there. That's why they cannot claim in court. The third requirement is section 6 subsection 2. If any written law negative or limits the liability of the officer in respect of any act, neglect or default committed by him, then to the extent the liability of the government is also limited or negative. In other words, okay, if any written law negative here means that if the law protects the officer from liable in tort, then the protection also must be extend to the liability of the governments. Meaning, if the officer is not liable for tort, the government also will not be liable. So this case these requirements can be discussed in the case of Zahra binti Hussein against governments of Malaysia. In this case, a claim was made by the plaintiff for compensation for her husband's death due to the negligence of the armed forces during the emergency period. The armed forces contended that they shot the victim after there was no answer given when they asked the victim to identify himself and they thought he was the enemy. So in this case, the government invoked Section 5 of the Emergency Ordinance 1969. So here this ordinance is referring to any written law here, which required to prove two ingredients that the act was done in good faith and reasonable belief that it was necessary for the purpose to be served thereby. So in this case, the officer of armed force is not liable. Okay, he shot the victim because he believed that the victim was the enemy. So since the officer was not liable, then the governments of Malaysia also not liable. The next requirement is under section 6 subsection 3. No action can be brought against the governments for any acts done or omitted to be done by a person exercising a judicial functions. Person exercising a judicial functions is normally a jury, when he decided the disputes or he makes the decisions. Okay, so no action can be brought against him or the governments. Next, section 6 subsection 4. The government is not liable for any act, neglects or defaults of an officer unless he was employed by the governments and paid in respect of his duties as an officer only out of the government's revenues. This is how you identify the government's officer. You must fulfill these requirements. He must be employed by the governments and then his salary based on the government's revenues. Next requirement based on section 7 subsection 1. No proceedings are to lie against the governments according to anything done or omitted to be done by the governments or any public officer in exercise of the public duties of the governments. So when the public officer is exercise of their public duties, there is no actions can be brought against them. So what are considered as the public duties? You may refer to the next section, section 7, subsection 2. For example, constructions, maintenance. Okay, for example, maintenance of railways, roads, bridle path or bridge, constructions, maintenance of schools, hospitals or other public buildings, drainage, flood preventions, reclamations, work of channels, rivers and waterways. These are constituted as public duties, belongs to the government's officer. So if they exercise these public duties, then there is no proceeding that can be brought against them. However, there is an exception based on section 7, subsection 3. A party may sue for damages or compensation arising out of negligence or trespass in the execution of any works of constructions or maintenance undertaken by the government in the exercise of its public duty. For example, okay, during the constructions of the road, okay, the officer committed negligence against the public. So, he can sue the officer and the governments because of negligence. For example, while constructing a hospital Al-Tuntun, the government's quantity surveyor instructed the contractor to use low quality cements, which consequently caused the floor of the buildings to collapse, injuring some of the building workers. An action can be taken against the governments because the injury was caused by an act of the government's officer in the exercise of public duty constructing a hospital. This case involved negligence because the government's officer failed to exercise the duty of care to protect the public from suffering damage. So in this case, the officer will be liable and the government is also liable. And the last requirements are based on section 22. If one wishes to sue the state governments, he or she has to file the suits against the state governments, not against any individual party. Okay, so first start your claim against the governments, okay, the state governments, not against any individual party. Alright, basically there are two landmark cases that you may refer in regards to the government's tortious liability. For example, you may refer to the case of Muhammad Raihan bin Ibrahim against the government of Malaysia. This happened in school. An action was brought against the government for an injury sustained by a pupil during a practical gardening class. What happens there? The students are given a changkul, however, without proper warnings by the supervisor or the teachers. So the federal what happens is that the the changkul, okay, the head of changkul was pulling off from the, and then it damaged and it injured the other party. Okay, and then he claims against the teacher and the school, and obviously he also claims against the governments of Malaysia. So in this case, the federal court allowed the appeal of the appellant, saying that even though it accepted the fact that the appellant was negligent, the respondent failed to give proper instructions as to the use of agricultural tools. The court also concluded that the respondent failed to take all reasonable and proper steps to prevent the appellants under their case from sustaining the injury, and that the teacher did not check the conditions of the gardening tools or provide a safe system of holding the gardening class. So in this case, the teacher breached of his duty of care, and that it resulted to injury to his students. Therefore, the government is also liable. Other case that you may read is government of Malaysia against Jumat bin Muhammad. This is also involve a school teacher. Okay, next we proceed with the government's liability in relation to military personal.